Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is July 6th, 2023. Now let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So I'm going to do a few updates on the map situation on different fronts. So first of all, let's hit Velika Novosilka. So the Ukrainians are advancing slowly here, but they're gaining some ground every single day. It's a brutal fight. And as I've indicated, and you guys probably know already why it's so slow. Well, obviously because Ukraine is trying to preserve lives. It's not the Russian style attack waves where they did not care about the amount of dead soldiers they would have. All they care about was the result. And the Ukrainians are not fighting that way. The Ukrainians are trying to preserve life. They're being careful. They're being safe. And they're not going to do stupid attacks if they see that they can do it otherwise. So it's just a matter of time. And the Ukrainians are advancing slowly. And at the same time, as I've said previously, the Ukrainians do not have air support right now. Ukraine has been asking for F-16s, Mirages, whatever jet fighters they could get ever since the conflict started, and they still haven't received them. And it's a very slow action from NATO and its Western partners. So Ukraine is frustrated because, in the history of, I guess, NATO offensives, there hasn't been a single time where they did not use jet fighters. It's an absolute must if you want to be effective. And Ukraine is fighting at a disadvantage here. So that's one of the reasons. And also, obviously, because of the defenses that the Russians have set up. They're massive. There's a lot of minefields to clear. And of course, the Ukrainians are taking their time to make sure that they can preserve as much life as possible. So right now, as the Ukrainians continue pushing, where they're currently trying to gain territory is on the west of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine. As you can see here, they continue pushing towards Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, but there's reports now that the Ukrainians might be in partial control over the village of Priutne, which is just west of Staromayorsk. And it's very slow, so it might still take a few weeks before we see Staromayorsk, Urozhaine being fully under Ukrainian control. But I feel like the more time goes by, the more the Russians get exhausted, and they just won't be having the capacity. At least I can't see within next year for the Russians to be able to continue holding the line. They're simply not capable of continuing their defense for long term. And also another thing I wanted to mention, and also mention in my next slide, is the fact that the Ukrainians right now have shifted their focus to hitting logistics. Russian logistics. So we've seen a lot of missile strikes as of late in different cities, where it be in Berdyansk, Tokmak, Melitopol, in Donbass, close to Donetsk. They've been hitting their ammo storage facilities, critical supply lines, fuel depots, just really making life hell. And that's usually been the bread and butter of the Ukrainian offensive, is hitting the logistical logistical supply lines of the Russians. And so far, it's been extremely effective at destroying those, ammunition depots and whatnot that are really, really far away from the front line. Remember, last year with the HIMARS systems, the Russians had it very close to the front line, but now, obviously, they learned from their mistakes. They learned from such events, and so they've really withdrawn their ammunition depots much further away, really even close to Crimea or close to the Russian border. So the Ukrainians are just continuing to strike the Russians. And so that will eventually exhaust their defensive capabilities. And another thing, before I go to the next slide, is that Ukraine will soon be receiving, that's been approved by the United States, cluster munitions, which is great because cluster munitions are great at pretty much destroying soldiers that are hiding in trenches. Whereas with an artillery strike or a regular shell, it's not as effective compared to a shell that explodes and sends a bunch of other small devices, small little tungsten balls or whatever, at the enemy. So it has a much more effectiveness in terms of eliminating or injuring the Russians. So hopefully the Ukrainians are going to go get them very soon and going to have a lot of effective use against the Russians. So that's positive. And so we'll start seeing a lot, I think, of developments by the end of this summer. But the Ukrainians right now still slowly try to grind through with the first kind of line of defense that the Russians have set up. Now, additionally, in Bakhmut in the south, the Ukrainians continue their push. So this is the 3rd Brigade, Assault Brigade, that is doing the work here. And this is around Klishivka. If you guys remember, a couple months ago, the Ukrainians lost this position. It has a high ground, as you can see here, over the village. And so the Russians are very close to losing it. Now, there's been reports a few days ago, pro-Russian sources said that they've lost it, but then they retracted that report and said actually the Russians still control it, which seems to be the case. The Ukrainians continued their assault in the north of Klishivka, in the south. As a matter of fact, the Russians tried, I think today or yesterday, to do counteroffensive, which has failed. They've been eliminated by the Ukrainian artillery. In the south of Klishivka, they sent a couple units, Russian units, and they were effectively destroyed at one of the posadkas around this area. So I'm expecting that within a week or two, the Ukrainians should be at least in partial control of Klishivka. They already have the high ground, and soon I think this village is going to be under Ukrainian control. And the Russians are panicking here because they realize that Klishivka is sort of this first step into encircling the south of Bakhmut. Afterwards, it's kind of very open terrain in Opitne, Odradivka, and other villages and small settlements after Klishivka. And the Ukrainians, if they have a safe position from the high ground, the Russians are going to be in trouble, not only in Bakhmut, but the surrounding settlements. So this is positive, and I think that the Ukrainians will be able to take this village in next week or two. Surely by the end of July, we should see some positive news, because the Ukrainians right now, from the footage I've been seeing, are doing very, very hard work to clear the Russian trenches that they have taken over the Ukrainian trenches. These were original Ukrainian trenches where they eventually retreated and the Russians took them over. So it's difficult here, but once the Ukrainians get through here, I think it's going to open the way for much faster, I think, liberation of other settlements outside. Now, last thing is I wanted to talk about Avdiivka, and this is north of Donetsk. This is one of the many settlements of Donetsk. Donetsk is very urban. It's very dense in terms of, previously prior to the war in terms of population. And the Ukrainians, which is what is fantastic about this is that they've been able to hold the line. This is the line of 2014. I've mentioned it many times over my previous videos that the Ukrainians here are very strong and they're capable of defending, which is extremely surprising considering the amount of years they've been fighting here. So the Ukrainians did a small counteroffensive. It's nothing like crazy, but you can see that they're trying to push out the Russians on both sides of Avdiivka. So from the west and from the east, if we're looking from this way. And so far they had some good success in east around the town Vesele. They pushed out the Russians a little bit, and I think that's the trend they want to continue. They want to flatten this front. They don't want the Russians to continue pushing here. And with this small little counteroffensive, they wanted to kind of flatten this the defensive position that the Russians have. They don't want to be kind of encircled, which is kind of a partial encirclement if you look at it on this map. And so the Ukrainians have gotten about a few square kilometers of gains here. So the fighting here is one of the most difficult because obviously Donetsk, which is just south of this of Avdiivka, is an extremely dense and populated area. So of course the Russians will have a lot of forces here, and it's by default the capital of Donbass for the Russians. Losing it, as I've said previously, would be catastrophic for Russia. They simply cannot allow to lose Donetsk. And the other thing is that the Russians have a lot of ammunition depots and other types of depots and supply lines around the suburbs and the outskirts of Donetsk. So the Ukrainians, especially in Makivka, have been hitting the Russians and pounding their ammunition depots. And there was one massive explosion that happened, I think 2 or 3 days ago, around Makivka, where the Russians simply just stored these Grad missiles in the open close to civilian buildings, and it just created a massive shockwave, a massive explosion in that area once the Ukrainians most likely hit it with HIMARS or perhaps even Storm Shadows or other missiles. So the Russians are not smart in the way that they store it, so things for them are getting worse and worse because they're getting less quality soldiers. The quality of the work that they provide is very bad, so expect more of these, poorly stored areas being hit by the Ukrainians with ease, especially because now they have the range to even hit them in Russia if they require to do so. Now, as a last update for my last presentation, Okay, I've been saying that for a while, but honestly, I think it's important to constantly remind my audience, my viewers, that there is no more hope for Russia to change anymore in terms of its population rising against Putin and somehow toppling the Putin regime. We saw that the only effective way of that happening would be through mutiny of the elites, such as Prigozhin's mutiny a few weeks ago, which failed because he didn't go all the way. So many assumed, according to this CBC article, that the average Russian would sour on the war in Ukraine, and that hasn't happened. And so there was a sort of a study, or I guess interview that was set with a few Russian people and Russian students. You would think that they would be at least smart in being able to decipher that this war is no good for them. They should be helping the Ukrainians rather than supporting them. So it's a small sample of people that were interviewed by this group, about 80 or 90, which is not a massive sample, but it kind of gives you an idea yet again at how the Russians think, because we don't have much information coming out of there. So parts of their findings included identifying a group that they have dubbed New Patriots, who are rooting for Russia and in some cases justifying the war, even if they didn't initially agree with it. They do not really believe that Russia's victory will bring real positive change in Russian society. However, they just feel that if Russia loses, it will be much, much worse, said Svetlana Erpileva, a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Bremen in Germany. And then there is another interesting part of this article. Obviously, it's a long article, so I didn't put everything in here. But here it says that one of these students, or one of these Russian women that was interviewed, said that I know lots of people, and I see lots of people on the internet who are saying, well, I used to support Ukraine, but I see that they truly hate us, Gritsenko said. Gritsenko, 21, said while she doesn't have blind support for the Russian government, she believes that as an Orthodox Christian, she has a responsibility to do her part and help those in need, including Russian soldiers. So it's a massive cognitive dissonance in the sense that they know that what they're doing is not good, but yet they feel that there's a responsibility to help the Russian soldiers to achieve victory, which is clearly not going to happen. But you can see that the reason why the Russians are not interested in stopping this war is because they wanted to win in the first place. They were totally fine once they got Crimea back in 2014. They were cheering, they were ecstatic, they were so happy, and they never really felt remorse at the fact that they literally stole and annexed a territory that wasn't theirs in the first place. And there was no protest in Russia against that. And so you can bet that if Russia had a successful invasion of Ukraine, they would be all cheering and saying how great Russia is, and spinning it as a great Russian victory and how great their population is, the best country in the world. But because they're losing, that's why they're angry, and that's why they realize that if they're going to decisively lose, it's going to be, as it says here, much, much worse for them. So they only care about themselves. They care about the fact that they don't want to face the consequences of the fact that they're a terrorist state, of the fact that they've been killing thousands, if not tens of thousands of innocent civilians, deporting children from Ukraine to Russia to assimilate them, right? And literally take away the parents away from the kids, or if not even killing them, destroy maternity wards. They just put, they put their head in the sand, and that's it. They completely ignore the fact that yes, it's a terrorist nation, not just a terrorist regime or government. Because by now, within we're a year and a half in of this war, we should have seen the Russian population doing something, revolting against their government, doing protests, partisans, attacking and destroying institutions that are helping this terrorist regime, killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. And even yesterday in Lviv, right, a city that is 1,000 kilometers away from Russia, they just struck a massive apartment building, and already a few innocent civilians are dead. And the Russians don't react to that anymore. They think it's totally justified, and that people like her, who's 21 years old, who are going to university, are completely blind. So this is very frustrating, and I just want to pass on the message to you guys that there is no more hope for the population in Russia to change. You can forget about that. And the only change that's going to happen is when Russia is going to completely lose this war, and there's going to be forced reforms on Russia and its population. And I'm imagining, as any, in the history of Russia, every time it failed, it had a revolution and the state has failed. And then, we look at 1917, or even after the Soviet Republic collapsed, Russia always lost territory. And here there's going to be a massive fracture of its population and of its territory. The Russia that we know as of today, is not going to exist in its same form, in my opinion, in the future once it completely collapses. That's evident because history has taught us multiple times that once that happens in Russia, they keep losing territory. So that's the video for today, guys. Let me know what you think about my comments for this last presentation. I hope you enjoy my video. Please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me be motivated to continue making these videos. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you and take care.